In one of the most unbelievable battles of World War II, a single wounded Gurkha soldier turned what should have been certain defeat into an immortal legend. With one hand shattered, one eye destroyed, and his body torn by shrapnel, Rifleman Lachiman Gurung refused to surrender. For 4 relentless hours, he faced more than 200 Japanese soldiers alone, holding his trench against impossible odds. He lost his hand, his sight in one eye, and much of his blood, but his courage saved his entire company and stopped the Japanese advance cold. This is not just a story of loss and pain, but of unbreakable will, of a man who proved that bravery can triumph even when the body has failed. What he sacrificed in flesh, he gained in immortality, earning the Victoria Cross and the eternal respect of 2 nations. May 12, 1945. A sodden trench hidden in the Burmese jungle. 3 Gurkha riflemen huddled in the dark, straining to hear the sound of at least 200 Japanese troops moving through the undergrowth toward them. Rifleman Lachiman Gurung, 27 and barely 4'11", clutched his Lee Enfield and waited. His position was the most advanced post on the British defensive line, the linchpin of the whole perimeter. If it fell, the enemy could turn the flank and annihilate 2 companies of Gurkha soldiers trapped behind them. At 1:20 a.m., the grenades began to arc in. Gurung watched the first land just outside the trench, snatched it up and hurled it back. The blast flashed through the trees and exposed dozens of Japanese charging his way. A second grenade landed inside the trench. He grabbed it and flung it out, where it detonated in midair. A third fell at his feet. He stooped to pick it up, and it exploded inside his hand. The blast tore off the fingers of his right hand. Shrapnel shredded his face, costing him his right eye. Burns and fragment wounds covered his arm, chest, and legs. The 2 men with him were also hit, and now 200 Japanese were screaming toward them, firing and tossing grenades. Bleeding, half-blind, and missing most of his right hand, Gurung should have been finished. Instead, he seized his rifle with his left hand and began to fire. For the next 4 hours, he held that forward trench alone, working the bolt with one hand, reloading, firing, and shouting challenges to the attackers. When dawn finally came and the Japanese withdrew, 31 enemy bodies lay before his position. 31 men felled by one-handed rifleman. According to every rule of battle, he should have died in the first minute. This is the untold account of perhaps the single most astonishing solo defense of World War II. From a mountain hamlet in Nepal, where a boy joined the British forces to escape grinding poverty, to the brutal fighting in Burma, where the Imperial Japanese Army learned the cost of attacking a Girka who refused to give in. From the instant a grenade destroyed his hand to the 4 hours of hell that led to the Victoria Cross. This is how one rifleman proved that bravery doesn't depend on having 2 hands, only on refusing to quit. Nepal, December 1917. Lachiman Gurung was born in Dakani, a tiny hillside hamlet west of Kathmandu. His father worked a small plot that barely fed the family. Mountain life meant hardship, backbreaking work, and almost no chance of advancement. Young men had 2 options: toil on the land like their fathers or enlist with the British Indian Army as Girkas, the famed Nepalese soldiers who had served Britain since 1815. Gurkhas carried a fearsome reputation throughout the empire. Disciplined, fearless, and lethal with the curved kukri each man carried. British commanders prized them above most other infantry. German soldiers in both world wars learned to dread facing Gurkha regiments, and Japanese troops in Burma were no exception. The Gurkha motto was blunt: better to die than be a coward. Gurung grew up on tales of Gurkha heroes, villagers who had won medals fighting for Britain in places like India, Afghanistan, and France. The army promised steady wages, respect, and an escape from subsistence farming. But enlistment demanded passing a harsh selection and meeting a minimum height of 5'0". Gurung stood at 4'11", an inch too short. In ordinary times, he would have been turned away, but 1940 was not ordinary. By December, the war had exploded across continents. Germany dominated much of Europe, and Japan was poised to sweep through Asia. Britain desperately needed recruits, and height limits were quietly relaxed. Gurung was accepted at age 23 and joined the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, one of the Army's most storied regiments. How he ended up enlisting has been told many ways. One version says his father sent him to buy cigarettes. He met a friend joining up and never returned with the cigarettes, disappearing instead into the army. 5 years later, he came home minus an eye and most of a hand. Whether that anecdote is literal or embellished, the facts stand. Gurung enlisted in December 1940. Completed training, learned the Lee Enfield, mastered jungle tactics, and absorbed the Gurkha code: aggressive attack, immovable defense, never surrender, never withdraw unless ordered, fight to the last man in the last round. These were not empty words, but the backbone of Gurkha identity. By 1944, his battalion was in Burma, a campaign defined by dense jungle, monsoon mud, and lethal diseases like malaria and dysentery that killed as many as combat. The Imperial Japanese Army, having seized much of Southeast Asia in 1942, fought without mercy. Their orders were often to fight to the death. Surrender was dishonorable and capture meant torture. British and Indian forces had been pushing the Japanese back since 1944. Operation Extended Capital aimed to recapture central Burma and sever Japanese supply lines. The 8th Gurkha Rifles were part of that push. They advanced through swamps, crossed rivers, and climbed jungle-clad hills, facing ambushes, snipers, and fanatical defenders who preferred close combat. By May 1945, the Japanese hold in Burma was breaking. Allied forces had crossed the Irrawaddy River and were pushing toward Rangoon, though many Japanese units still sought to fight their way out of encirclement. On May 9th, the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles was ordered to block Japanese escape routes near the village of Tongda. The land was thick with jungle and dotted by muddy trails. The monsoons had begun. Everything was wet, slick, and miserable. The Gurkha companies dug in and waited. Intelligence indicated Japanese movement in the area, but not numbers or timing, only that an attack was coming. Garang's company, C Company, occupied reverse-slope positions with trenches cut into the hillside and overlapping fields of fire. The jungle, however, limited visibility to only a few dozen yards, allowing infiltrators to approach close before being seen. The Japanese excelled at silent infiltration, night attacks, and overrunning posts before defenders could react. The Gurkha men knew they could expect violence, speed, grenades, and brutal close quarters fighting with bayonets and knives. Garang's section was given the most forward and perilous post. 3 men in a trench roughly 100 yards ahead of the main line, tasked with early warning, delaying any Japanese advance, and buying the company time to respond. It was effectively a suicide assignment, the first hit, the hardest to reinforce, and most likely to be overrun. Gurung and 2 comrades improved the post as best they could, deepening the trench, stacking sandbags, clearing fields of fire, and keeping ammunition within reach. Gurung set his kukri on the trench parapet, ready within arm's reach should the enemy close. The curved blade had been the Gurkha's close combat weapon for generations. He intended to use it if needed. On the night of May 12th, the Japanese launched not a probing raid, but a full-scale assault. At least 200 soldiers struck C Company's sector with grenades. Machine gun and rifle fire and screaming charges meant to break spirits and punch through the line. The entire blow was aimed at Gurung's forward section, and his trench was the keystone. At 1:20 a.m., Naik Debasing Buddha, Gurung's section commander, had just checked his men when the grenades began to fall. Japanese troops crept up under darkness, lobbing grenades to soften defenders before the main push. From his trench a few yards back, Buddha saw a grenade land near Gurung's position and watched him scoop it up and toss it back. The explosion revealed dozens of attackers rushing in. Gurung managed to grab a second grenade and throw it out. It detonated overhead. Then a third arced into the trench and blew in his hand before he could throw it. The blast mangled his right hand, tore off fingers, and wrecked his palm. Shrapnel destroyed his right eye and riddled his face. Burns and fragments scarred his arm and chest and struck his legs. The concussion hurled him backward. The 2 other men in the trench were also wounded by the same blast. Seconds later, 200 Japanese were almost upon them. The other Gurkha were badly hurt, bleeding and dazed. The assault was moments from overrunning the post. Any normal response would have been to fall back to the main line and seek medical aid. Survival instincts would have demanded it. Lachiman Gurung did none of that. He seized his rifle with his left hand. The Lee Enfield was built to be fired right-handed, its bolt action intended for the right hand to cycle rounds. Garang's right hand was a ruined, bloody wreck. He adapted. He wedged the rifle against his left hip, operated the bolt with his left hand, aimed with his remaining eye, and opened fire into the silhouettes advancing through the night. The Japanese expected corpses or wounded men to stop their charge. Instead, they encountered a Gurkha who shot back with deadly accuracy and speed, killing those leading the assault, taunting them in Gurkhali, daring them to fight, refusing to die. The shock froze the attackers for vital seconds, enough for Gurung to cut down several more and to plant confusion among the ranks. The enemy regrouped and hurled more grenades into and around the trench, but Gurung could no longer toss them back. He pressed against the trench wall, let explosions wash over him, took more shrapnel and burns, and kept firing. Japanese soldiers tried to rush the emplacement and were gunned down one after another. The bodies piled up and became obstacles that slowed the living. From his position behind Garang, Nayak Debasing Buddha watched in stunned disbelief. He had seen Girka valor before, but this exceeded any normal measure of courage. A grievously wounded man fighting with the effectiveness of a whole squad. Buddha tried to send reinforcements, but enemy fire was too intense. Anyone attempting the short dash to the forward trench would be cut down before halfway. So Garang remained alone, one man with one eye and one hand, facing 200 determined attackers trying to break through. The physical task was nearly impossible. The Lee Enfield weighed about 9 pounds. Cycling the bolt one-handed while aiming and firing demanded strength, coordination, and practice Gurung had never trained for. He learned it on the spot, under a hail of enemy fire, bleeding from dozens of wounds, half-blind, while Japanese soldiers kept coming to kill him. The agony must have been unbearable. A mangled right hand, a shattered eye, shards of metal driven into his flesh, and searing burns. Such wounds send the body into shock and heavy bleeding drains strength. Most men would have lost consciousness, but Lachiman Gurung clenched his will and stayed awake because he had a duty: hold the trench, stop the Japanese, and protect his comrades. Everything else, even his own life, came second. The attackers could not make sense of it. They outnumbered the defenders by at least 50-1, struck the weakest point in the British line, enjoyed surprise and momentum, and yet a single grievously wounded Gurkha was stalling their whole assault. Officers tried to rally men and force the position, but every push met the same outcome: rifle fire, fallen soldiers, and a voice from the forward post bellowing defiance. The enemy altered tactics and attempted to get around the trench. Gurung adjusted his aim to cover those approaches. The dense jungle and narrow fronts forced attackers into predictable killing zones, and Gurung was covering each lane. The night was mostly black, only the explosions briefly revealing the carnage. He fired at muzzle flashes, at noises, at moving shadows, striking targets he could barely make out with a rifle he struggled to operate. His section commander later described him as fighting like a demon, something beyond ordinary human endurance. Every few seconds another Japanese soldier would fall. The enemy never quite located his exact position. The flash from his rifle shifted as he moved within the trench, and the Japanese groped for him with wild, inaccurate fire while his shots found their marks. Trained to be deadly with a rifle, he remained more precise than many who still had both hands and full sight. Time lost meaning as the night became an unending roar of gunfire, explosions, and screams. Gurung fired until his magazine was empty, then reloaded with his left hand, a task built for 2 hands that took far longer when done single-handed. Each reload gave the attackers a chance to close, so he forced himself to speed up, feeling for cartridges in the dark, loading by touch, and getting back into the fight. This cycle repeated hundreds of times. More grenades rained in. Some found their mark and added more shrapnel and pain. Blood loss and shock steadily eroded his strength and vision, and he was aware of himself dimming. But the assault kept coming, and if he stopped, the Japanese would break through and his brothers would die. An outcome he could not accept. He squeezed off shot after shot. Ammunition grew critical. He had begun with a basic load, roughly 50 rounds in his pouches and 10 in the rifle, and he fired steadily, making every bullet count. He had to strike a balance. Use enough ammunition to hold the enemy at bay while conserving enough to survive until dawn or relief. He had no clear sense of how many rounds remained. He simply kept firing, emptying and reloading as needed. Around 3 in the morning, the enemy intensified their effort. This was no last-ditch chaos, but an organized push. Officers rallied their men for another coordinated attempt, striking from several directions with grenades, machine guns, and human waves, willing to accept heavy losses to overwhelm that single stubborn post. Gurung met them the same way he had from the start: steady, accurate, relentless fire. He was now acting on pure reflex, training so ingrained that his body moved without conscious thought. Aim, fire, cycle bolt, aim, fire. His left hand worked mechanically, his remaining eye locked on targets, and his rifle barked again and again as attackers fell and the assault broke on his trench like surf on rock. By about 4 in the morning, the Japanese drive faltered. Officers could not rally men for another assault because casualties and fear of the unseen shooter had mounted. They still outnumbered the defenders but could not concentrate force without crossing Gurung's killing ground, and nobody wanted to be the next man to die before that trench. Gurung used the pause to assess his condition. He was barely conscious, bleeding, and in shock. His right hand hung useless, his right eye was destroyed, and fragments peppered his body. Every movement sparked fresh agony. He fumbled through his pouches for cartridges and found only a few. Maybe enough for one more encounter, maybe not. He did not think of medical care or evacuation, only of the dark, the next assault, and keeping his rifle ready. Behind him, C Company held its positions and could hear the firefight at the forward post, but the jungle and night limited their support. Naik Debasing Bora reported up the chain. One heavily wounded rifleman was still holding the forward position and halting a major Japanese attack. The commander at first found it hard to believe until he heard the pattern of fire, single, controlled shots coming from the forward trench. Reinforcements could not reach Gurung because the Japanese controlled the ground between his post and the main line. Any relief attempt would have been cut down. So he remained alone, wounded, outnumbered, and low on ammunition, yet still refusing to yield. The Japanese had concentrated their full force on that one point and failed. One man had stopped them, a man who by any rational measure should have been dead within minutes. As dawn neared, the enemy launched a final, desperate charge. They needed to break through before daylight exposed them to Allied air and artillery. They gathered their remaining strength and surged toward Gurung's position, accepting further losses in the belief that sheer numbers would finally overwhelm him. He answered with his last rounds. When his rifle went empty, he reached for his kukri, the curved utility and fighting blade every Gurkha carried, prepared to use it one-handed if the enemy reached the parapet. Better to die than be a coward. The final assault broke before it reached him. Attackers fell, and the survivors retreated into the jungle as daylight erased their concealment. Staying meant being caught by Allied aircraft and artillery, so the Japanese slipped away, leaving their dead. At first light on May 13th, Naik Debasing Bora and other Gurkhas rushed forward, expecting to find their comrade dead. Instead, they found Lachiman Gurung barely alive, slumped in the trench amid empty casings, his rifle in his lap and his kukri within reach. His right hand was destroyed, his right eye gone, and his body was soaked in blood, but he remained conscious and alert to the jungle, ready to fight again if needed. They hauled him out, gave water and field dressings. The wounds were catastrophic. His right hand was irreparably damaged and was later amputated. His right eye was permanently blind. Surgeons removed shrapnel and treated burns. They saved his life, but not the limb or the eye. While he was evacuated, comrades surveyed the ground and were stunned. 31 dead Japanese lay within a few yards of his position. 31 confirmed kills by one-handed man in 4 hours of continuous combat. Blood trails and scattered equipment showed many more enemy casualties and wounded who had been dragged away. The recommendation for the Victoria Cross followed immediately. Naik Debasing Bora filed a full report of what he had seen, supported by the company commander and forwarded up the chain. This was the sort of deed that matched the highest standards of valor. A single soldier holding an impossible post against overwhelming odds. fighting despite catastrophic wounds, refusing to retreat or surrender and saving his company by sheer grit and marksmanship. The Victoria Cross citation was approved and appeared in the London Gazette on August 9, 1945. It recorded that the rifleman had borne the brunt of an attack by at least 200 enemy troops, had twice thrown back grenades and then had a third explode in his right hand, destroying fingers and badly wounding him, yet had loaded and fired with his left hand for 4 hours, meeting each attack at point-blank range and causing 31 enemy deaths around his position. The citation could not fully capture the horror he endured. Hours of unrelenting combat, bleeding and half-blind, operating a bolt-action rifle one-handed in pitch darkness against an enemy that outnumbered him by roughly 50-1. No aid, no reinforcement, no retreat, only duty, courage, and the Gurkha code, better to die than be a coward. Gurung recovered in military hospitals while the war drew to a close. Japan surrendered in August and the Burma campaign ended. He never returned to combat. He went back to Nepal missing an eye and a hand, wearing the Victoria Cross, one of only 13 Gurkhas ever to receive it. Civilian life was hard. Farming was difficult with one hand, and the small pension offered by the British government did not cover much. He struggled financially for years, but married, raised children, and became widely revered in Nepal as the one-handed Gurkha who had killed 31 enemy soldiers. His story became part of local lore and school lessons. In 1995, 50 years after Tongda, he traveled to London for Victoria Cross commemorations, met other recipients, and was honored by Queen Elizabeth II at ceremonies including the Imperial War Museum. People wanted to hear how he had done it. His answer remained plain: I was a Gurkha. I had my duty. I did what needed doing. Over time, the British government improved pensions for Gurkha veterans, and Gurung used his status to advocate for better welfare for his fellow soldiers, stressing that Nepali servicemen had faithfully served Britain and deserved proper care. He spent the rest of his life in Nepal and remained a living symbol of Gurkha courage. Lachiman Gurung died on December 12, 2010, aged 92. His passing was mourned across Nepal and Britain, remembered by military units and covered in the press. He was cremated according to Hindu rites, and his Victoria Cross was preserved as a family and national relic. His single-night stand at Tongda continues to be retold. The 8th Gurkha Rifles and other units teach recruits about his action, so the cycle of memory continues. The Gurkha Museum in Winchester displays his citation and photographs so visitors can learn of the night when one badly wounded Gurkha stopped 200 soldiers. His story's lesson is simple. He was not superhuman or specially privileged. He came from a poor mountain family and lacked any extraordinary gear or training beyond what his regiment taught him. What set him apart was duty, courage, and the refusal to quit when retreat would have been entirely rational. The Japanese attackers were experienced, fanatical fighters who had swept much of Asia and held every tactical advantage except for one. They had to face a Gurkha who would not be moved, who would not die, and who would not let them pass. Modern soldiers study Gurung's action to understand its psychology and conditions, but the essence is straightforward. He was trained. He showed extraordinary courage and unshakable loyalty to his comrades. When the moment arrived, he acted like generations of Gurkhas before him. He fought. He didn't weigh probabilities or search for alternatives. He had one duty: hold that trench, and he fulfilled it. Everything else faded into insignificance. The physical obstacles were staggering. A bolt-action rifle is meant to be handled with 2 hands. Reloading is a 2-handed task. Aiming accurately with a single eye in total darkness is almost impossible. Staying conscious after massive wounds and blood loss defies medical expectations. Yet he managed every one of those things, not because he was invulnerable, but because he refused to accept any other option. The trench would stand because he would not allow it to fail. The Japanese would not break through because he would not permit them to. Plain and simple. It's tempting to treat what he did as an outlier, an unrepeatable miracle beyond ordinary soldiers. He would have dismissed that idea. He saw himself as an ordinary Gurkha doing his duty, nothing supernatural, just a rifleman who would not give up. His lesson for future generations is clear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Duty is not following orders when convenient, but doing the job when it seems impossible. Honor is not simply victory, but refusing to accept defeat. The trench where Lachiman Gurung made his stand has long since vanished. The Burmese jungle has swallowed that slope, and the physical traces have been erased by time and weather. The event itself, however, lives on. It is passed down within Gurkha regiments, taught to recruits, examined by historians, and honored in Britain and Nepal. 31 dead Japanese soldiers, 4 hours of hell, 1 broken hand, 1 lost eye, 1 Gurkha who would not die. When people ask how he accomplished it, the answer is both plain and deep. He was a Gurkha. Better to die than be a coward. On May 13, 1945, Lachiman Gurung proved those words were not mere rhetoric. They were a creed, a duty, and the essence of who he was. The Japanese learned that truth the hardest way possible, and the world learned what a single determined man with one hand can achieve when he simply refuses to quit. If this tale moved you, please like the video. Stories like this require days of research to unearth, and your support helps us bring more forgotten World War II heroes to light. Subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Share where you're watching from in the comments, your country and city, and tell us if you or your family served or if you know anyone who fought with Gurkha regiments. Have you heard other accounts of soldiers facing impossible odds? Leave your memories and thoughts below. Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive. Lachiman Gurung deserved more than a passing line in history. He deserved to be remembered as the warrior he was,